Hello there, I'm Tim, and he's John, and he's Days, and he's Torag, and this is How to Murder Time, a podcast about games and things.
Hello, everybody.
Watcher!
We've expanded.
We've got some help. Yes, this
Yeah,
is a new thing. This is a new thing we're trying. So regular listeners to the show might know that I'm becoming something of a bit of an obsessive bore about classic science fiction, in particular the Hugo Awards, which have just happened again this year, which we'll probably talk about at some point. But what I thought might be fun is to have a crack at reviewing some of the great classics of the past, some of the award-winning science fiction dating all the way back to 1953 was the first winner. And so I've sent my little gang of chums here to go away and spend a month reading these books, and then we'll come back and chat about it. And that's pretty much what we're going to do here. Oh, hello, who's that? Clattering around there. There's definitely real people here, see. So we're going to start, I thought we might as well start with the first one. This is The Demolished Man by Alfred. This was the winner of 1953's Hugo Award for Best Novel, and was the first winner of the category. I think back then they just didn't really have a vast number of categories at all. So we're going to have a quick go over it and see what we think and how it stands up and how it went down today. So the book I'll read the blurb off the back of the book. In a world in which the police have telepathic powers, how do you get away with murder? Ben Reich heads a huge 24th century business empire spanning the solar system. He is also an obsessed, driven man determined to murder a rival. To avoid capture in a society where murderers can be detected even before they commit their crime is the greatest challenge of his life. So there it is. So, basically the plot unfolds. It's a kind of police procedural. It's a sort of early example of a howdunit, where the crime itself is committed very early on in plain sight of the viewer, and then the bulk of the book is essentially the efforts of the police to try and bring the perpetrator to justice. And this is a format we see quite a lot in modern TV shows, CSI, Columbo, that kind of thing. Quite revolutionary back then, though. And of course, the twist being that the police are psychic, so how do you hide a crime from them? And there's a cat and mouse game ensues spanning the whole solar system in a sort of 25th century, 27th century, 24th century. Just read it. And then we basically follow the ins and outs of the cat and mouse game of the police to its conclusion. It's an interesting book. So let's go around and see what folks think. Torag, hello.
Hello there.
Hello.
So, I'm a bit scared.
You're a bit scared.
I've dreamed of being on this podcast since the dawn of time. I've finally arrived.
You're here. Hello. I hope you're going to be worth your vast fee. So, yes, the book. Then, how did you get on with it? Did you enjoy it? Was it good?
It was powerful. It was really, really
powerful. Absolutely.
It sort of ran through. You had no time to catch your breath. There was so much energy in it. You can see why it won. This is a book that grabs hold of readers and they don't forget it afterwards.
There's not really a lot of sort of spare pacing or downtime or breather chapters or anything like that. It is sort of bam, 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 events, twists all the way through. Yeah.
In fact, it wouldn't make a good police procedural on American TV because it's too quick. There'd be no time for an advert break. It's just run, charge.
Well, sort of cliffhangers every sort of 10 minutes or so, or even shorter. Yeah. The overall sort of main arc of the story then. So we got basically a sort of two very powerful figures sort of battling out across the solar system. How did that work well? Were those characters believable, interesting?
I liked them both. I found them both fascinating in their own ways. The Ben Reich character, because it started off writing it from his point of view.
Yes.
And he was someone that I could happily read about what he was doing, even though he has the, emotional maturity of Donald Trump. There's something broken about him because he's this high-powered executive that looks at everyone as little objects to move around.
Oh, he's a sort of very archetypal, powerful businessman type, isn't he? Yeah.
Yeah, he is a sociopath. Or at least, if not, then he certainly comes across as the bad guy.
Mm-hmm.
But he has that charm that normally sociopaths, it's difficult to warm to them. And somehow he managed to charm me enough to be happy to follow what he was doing.
Yeah. I mean, I certainly started off sort of sympathising with a bit, but then sort of Powell, the sort of main police sort of antagonist, protagonist, whichever, and it sort of switches as you go. You find it hard to work out who you're rooting for as it goes through. Powell comes in sort of later and stronger in the later stages.
Yeah, but when it changed to Powell's point of view, I immediately, within sort of a few paragraphs, I'd switched to rooting for him, where I had been rooting for Reich. And that was really, I'm impressed by how they managed to manipulate me quite so neatly into sort of, oh, this is the guy I'm with, this is the guy I'm with. And as you looked at it further on, you were thinking, why on earth did I follow Reich? He's a horror, he's a monster. I loved the whole creation of this Esper idea, because you get big ideas in science fiction, and in this you've got the Esper power is the big idea.
The idea that the police are psychic. It's often a lot of science fiction hinges on one or two very sort of interesting novel concepts, and then sort of spins it out and tries to explore the world those imply. But this definitely seemed to be more to it than just the science.
Yeah, I was going to say,
the police are psychic.
Yeah, the best thing was, despite the fact that was the big change, that's the big thing, they still had to find physical proof. You couldn't use psychic powers to find someone guilty. You could only use physical proof, and you still had to behave in a way that didn't just dominate the universe. They had these powers, and they were a bit like sort of doctors. They had to use their powers for good, or bad things would happen to them. So I liked that sort of. They were slightly crippled in the same way that in police procedurals, they still have to read people Miranda rights. They're not allowed to lie to get that, to find people guilty. There are things that hold them back that they have to work against. And then in this, they were working against a really, really sort of boring computer. That was the least interesting thing in the entire thing, really.
So it's interesting, the sort of restraints and sort of strictures that are placed upon people who, if just left to their own devices, and if they wanted to do whatever they want, this whole book would be solved within within the first sort of 20 pages. These sort of all-powerful psychics with no real controls over them, not having to play by any rules.
Yeah, it was the fact that Powell was sort of, the first time they met, he was sort of, well, I know you did it. Yeah, well, you can't prove it yet. And that was pretty much the first thing they said to each other.
Yes, yeah. So hello, Daze. Welcome to the show. So how did you get on with it? And
it's very strange. It's many different things at once. The police procedural is really strong in there, but the sort of the character-based drive of it all. There's quite a small set of characters, and they delve into each character quite deeply. Sometimes short and snappy, but each character is really sort of well painted. A really sort of great thumbnail if they're one of the sort of the smaller characters. But the main characters, it spends the first third of the book, I think, with Reich in his head, all sort of introducing.
You really do get to know him, yeah.
Yeah, sort of. When I was writing some notes for these, I wrote that the main motif you're introduced to Reich with is anger. He starts out angry. He's angry all the way through, and that just sort of leaps off the page. This sort of sense of rage and drive that this character has as he's doing all these things, sort of through the plot of the book.
And there's a sense that extends well beyond this book, and that is just him. That's how he. That's how he. Because he starts. Basically, the book opens with him at the head of a vast solar system-wide commercial empire, and basically agonising about the potential of not being the top dog, not having the best company, and that's sort of part of the events around that, what sparked the whole murder off.
And even something simple like right at the start of the book, but all the way through, as you're introduced to his underlings, characters who are working for him, he definitely considers less. People he can manipulate, pieces on his board he can push,
resources,
and sort of hit with hammers regularly,
sort of head of
a
research department,
or
the woman who works for his marketing agency, that sort of thing. They're all tools to be used. Yeah,
and that sense of disdain right from the very start. I think you're introduced to his manservant right at the start, and just the sense of him manipulating people really does sort of come off there. He's aware of his limitations. He's aware that he has issues dealing with people, and constantly during about the first sort of 10 or 20 pages, he's always thinking, what should I do? He's aware that he can't
things
run around.
Don't just happen.
Yeah. How can he manipulate the situation to get that person to respond well socially to him? And I think that goes to sociopathic or psychotic. That it's always dangerous trying to diagnose characters off a book or in real life either. But that's how he comes across. He's broken. He's a damaged person coping with himself.
successful business people are often sort of described as being somewhat psychopathic anyway, or sociopathic, just as the traits that drive them to do well in business. And that's sort of almost understood and written straight into the character. Sort of 50 years, 1953 or whatever. This is a sort of well understood analysis, and yet that sort of comes up as startling psychological revelations in this day and age. So definitely ahead of its time in that regard, I suppose, with character motivations and stuff.
And the way he fits into the business, the way his underlings fit into the business structure, this has been described as one of the early cyberpunk books in some ways, and that sort of business conglomerates dominating the world. It's very deftly drawn. It's not the sort of a complicated treatise on business structure economics. It's not sort of grim and gritty, but the picture it paints of these sort of industrial leviathans consuming everything, absorbing everything, and Amazon
carving up the solar system between them and doing their super high level stratospheric business deals and stuff, and the little people being I mean, obviously Gibbs, everyone knows Neuromancer and William Gibson being credited with the invention of cyberpunk and the archetypal novel and so on, and probably we'll come to that because Neuromancer won a Hugo in its day, but seeing these kinds of power plays going on and this kind of world and this kind of structure of it all, very much very much, I suppose, the prototype for that kind of thing.
Yeah, and some of the science fiction elements, video phones, long distance communications, interplanetary travel, they're there to provide structure for the business dealings and get people from place A to place B. They're quite interesting of themselves as video phones, mobile phones, FaceTime, whatever, and
punch card computers here and there as well.
It's endearing, and
well, you can't get every prediction right, but also those. I see what you mean in those sort of science fiction touches, the casual interstellar travel. Never really explained in any technical depth at all. You're right; they purely exist to accelerate the story, to get people from one planet to another. We'll need a rocket of some sort. Okay, well, let's not bog down on how the rocket works, which I think can often be a mistake in science fiction.
I'll pop off to the rocket ship and I'm over on Venus. Next scene. Yeah.
Exactly. You use the technology to advance the story and to examine the characters. Fantastic stuff. So, hello, John. You still here?
Hello.
How did you get on with this one?
I really liked it. I was actually surprised about how much I liked it. To be honest, I liked it less as it went on.
Yeah,
but that's just because the start
powerful
of it
open, but
the start was just so fantastic.
It's very high paced. The parts, the crime itself, and the initial sort of manoeuvrings. Yeah,
but the main takeaway from this book is you read all the way through and you just see things and you just think, oh, actually, that has echoed back all the way since this book is written and has shown up in other bits of writing. You can see, no doubt we'll talk about Babylon 5 later on, which is vitally important, but stuff like Minority Report is sort of like the opposite of this book.
But many of the concepts involved there.
I could imagine that was written in response to this in a great many ways. And you just look and see what was in this originally. And
the original Minority Report was the Philip K. Dick novel, was it?
Yeah.
Yes. Okay. I keep getting bogged down with I'm missing out on a lot of Philip K. Dick, but I keep bogged down with the film. But that essentially revolves around sort of predicting crimes and so on.
Minority Report was 1956.
Right.
So straight after this book.
Yeah, 3 years.
And I don't believe that it's a coincidence that they are so close in being polar opposites of the same idea of these people can tell so much about what is going on or what is about to go on, and so how do you police that? What do you do with it?
I suppose the sort of functional difference being that in the Demolished Man, the police can read minds, but they can't predict the future, whereas Minority Report sort of works the other way, does it?
Minority Report is predicting that crimes are going to happen.
Pre-crime,
which is it's the same. It's the psychic powers, which mean that you cannot get away with a crime.
Yeah,
it is physically impossible. The state knows what's going on, or whoever's got these powers knows what's going on.
Which raises all sorts of questions about sort of, freedom of thought and so on. What to what degree is privacy even a thing anymore if these kinds of powers exist? And it's interesting to see sort of Bester examine and explore and work through that. The idea of, it's no good. We're going to have to put all sorts of laws in to say that you can't actually admit psychic confessions or mind reading into court. You still have to prove it all the old-fashioned way, because even back in the sort of 50s when you're sort of examining these ideas, obviously the idea of, well, at what point does society collapse if no one can have private thoughts anymore?
Well, you've also, of course, got Orwell writing about it a couple of years earlier, in the idea that when you're total surveillance, what
Which-
can you get away with?
Which psychic police effectively can become. Yeah,
So
exactly.
there was certainly a paranoia at the time, which this really does hook into. The idea behind this book is terrifying, that there are these class of people who are so far above you. They have every single advantage, and the only thing keeping them in check is the fact that they work for an organisation that has rules, or are enslaved to an organisation which has rules, depending on how you look at it.
But yeah, certainly the Esper organisation, the Esper Guild, quite extensively throughout the middle and late sections of this book, which essentially is a sort of kind of guild, a kind of union that all the psychers basically have to join, all the Espers, and they are quite clearly. I mean, they seem to be a benign organisation on the face of it, but clearly are conducting some kind of eugenics program throughout the book. Powell is continually hounded by the Esper Guild because he's supposed to find another Esper to marry and have children with, and he's not allowed to marry non-Espers because obviously they're trying to promote and strengthen the gene and so on. So Tarag, did you find? See, this was the thing. This is one of the reasons I tended, even towards the second half, I tended to sort of side with Reich more than Powell, because just the Esper Guild started to become more and more of a sinister organisation in my mind as we went on.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things I did like was that Reich, who had no Esper powers at all, found a way to fight back against that.
That is probably the redeeming characteristic, the heroism of it, is how do you fight back against people who are an order of magnitude more advanced than yourself.
And that idea of the little earworm that just blocks the connection and blocks reading was brilliant and really well written into what was going on. You could see him just getting this stuck in his head all the time when people were trying to read what he was saying, and they knew that he was hiding something, but they couldn't quite work out what he was hiding.
Yeah,
I was impressed by that.
To explain, basically, Reich, when planning his murder, because this is a cold-blooded assassination, it's not a passion murder. He does plan it and go through with it all, and he knows that he's going to be sort of interrogated by psychic police. So he goes off to his advertising agency executive woman, and the chief of the agency, she comes up with essentially what amounts to the kind of shaken back advert song, one of those awful earworm songs from an advert that you hate but can't get out of your head, and basically she's got a couple of these on stock and teaches one to Reich, and then he basically just keeps repeating, singing this mantra to himself in his head over and over anytime a psycho comes nearby, and that sort of seems to be enough to throw them off of his sort of surface level intentions and so on. And very clever, and that sort of taps into the overall planning and the meticulousness that goes on. But yeah, sort of the overall overriding power of the psycho is a very difficult thing. The opening premise, how do you do that? How do you get away with murder?
And of course, he also got some psychers to help him. He'd already corrupted one to his side. He managed to corrupt a second to help him out.
Yeah, that sort of lets the whole cleverness of the plan down a little bit for me, in that the way to get rid of psychic police is to just bribe some of them. If you've got enough money, you can just buy some off.
Well, isn't that just the story of life?
I suppose,
because they're human as well as being psychic. They're not an other form of aliens, sort of existence. No. Exactly.
Well, so it isn't the idea that it's fear of the future, that you're being left behind by these advances, but their weakness is consumerism, which is the jingles, and the fact that they are still available to be bribed with money.
Yes, human follies, human frailties. That's when I sort of found myself losing sort of sympathy with the whole sort of good guys of the book, if you will, most of the way to, sort of from the middle onwards. Is I suppose it's because that it's the idea that the future of humankind is going to, by necessity, not involve us. It's who wants to sort of lay down and let the next, Homo superior take over? Who wants to get out of the way of the future? It's a sort of species-wide reminder of our mortality, I suppose.
But isn't that also a generation
thing? Characters, isn't it?
Yeah, it's a generation thing. Every generation feels that about the one that comes next. Every bit of technology is scary. Every new fad is scary.
Yeah. And so what you've got is this Esper Guild who, yes, they lend their services to high-level business. There are a couple of them hired as corporate secretaries because they're very good at remembering things. A lot of them work for the police. They're all in very, very high-profile positions. A lot of them are psychotherapists and doctors, dream analysts, that kind of thing. They're all in the sort of key positions of the future, of this future world and doing their thing. But clearly there's a sort of greater motive and a grand plan going on. And the Guild of Espers, the bits we see where we're there, the council are discussing things. they are essentially and somewhat complacently planning to be the future of mankind. They're sort of promoted. They've got the eugenics going on. They're sort of promoting themselves forward into the future.
Yeah, but one thing I did like is that they didn't just obsess about that, because so many people writing this idea, and they'd have had the espers are going to be taking over, and that's all they'd have talked about. They'd have talked about, this big thing, it's changing the world, and they'd have got into exquisite, tedious detail about all the things that were changing.
Whereas Bester has that almost as a sort of B-plot, and
exactly.
not that dwelt on at all.
With Bester, you've got this murder and the driven paranoia of the main character.
Yeah.
And by the way, there's these espers.
Yeah.
And having it as the big change in the world is by the by. And yes, it interacts in a lot of ways with what's going on. But the thing that drives you through the whole story is the murder and the drive of the main character.
It is the cat and mouse game.
It's rather than just sort of getting lost in the technical details of the change. Whereas a lot of science fiction does that. We've got faster than light travel. Here's five chapters exactly about how faster than light travel works. And you just think, can I skip the 5 chapters?
I think a lot of the best science fiction examines the consequences of advance and what the advance means to us as a species and as people. Yeah.
Well, don't forget, with fast light travel, even Star Trek, at its worst, never really explained it. It just said it went wrong and came up with some stupid reason it went wrong. It never sat down and explained it in detail.
Yeah, because obviously you come unstuck, it gets dated, people start to actually discover real physical rules later that disprove it all anyway.
That's the advantage of a TV show where you can't spend 5 chapters explaining it in detail. Mm-hmm. Thank goodness for that, yeah. Although they tried with the first film, and oh dear God, yes, they took far too long explaining far too many things. But I love the way the espers all reacted with each other, because there was the class divide of the espers as well.
So the espers divide their society up into essentially how powerful an esper you are, and there are 3 levels, 1, 2, and 3. 3 being the class 1 espers are the best, and Lincoln Powell, the police detective, is one of those, and there's a few others. There's lots of 2s around. And I think Reich can only manage to hire 1 class 1. That's Gus Tate, isn't it? And to work for him. But there's all sorts of 2s and 3s of lesser powers running around as well. And it's all quite a stratified kind of society, based on essentially a meritocracy, I suppose.
Yeah, I do like the structure they put in place for the espers, because that provides sort of just as normal human beings feel oppressed or feel superseded by espers as an amorphous whole, within the esper group, you've got the thirds who look up to the seconds, and the seconds who look up to the first, and the first look down at the second and the thirds. It's something that could just dissolve into fearful, the norms pointing at the espers hating the norms or feeling supercilious. The structure all the way up and down, everybody's contained in their little box.
Because I think, is it Jerry Church, who's sort of a minor character that aids Reich? He's quite bitter and sort of quite antagonistic towards the overall structure of the Esper Guild, and that's the one way Reich manages.
From the guild, hasn't
he's been sort of ostracised for earlier misdemeanors, and that's the one way Reich manages to get him on board. But you can see there's a sort of not so much all of us espers are in it together against the normals. No, you're quite right. There are sort of bickerings and bitternesses within the division, which essentially keeps them human. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think the party sequence, which is sort of quite near the
close
to the
party,
book, where we're introduced to some of those Esper characters, sort of during that opening third of the book. That's just a wonderful viewing into the Esper world, just giving you an idea of what it will be like, but social hierarchies and how they communicate.
It's sort of presented
the
as
typography. I'll be the first who says the typography. It's just wonderfully evocative of a different mode of communication.
Because it's sort of presented as listening into the hubbub of a sort of dinner, a cocktail party or whatever, and you can hear snippets of various conversations. But the way they're laid out, literally in typographic form in the book, is quite interesting. And sort of all these different sentences are interweaving and crossing and joining and so on. Very clever, and that sort of gives you. I mean, it's the challenge, isn't it? How do you write a telepathic party? and
make it feel alien but still comprehensible at the same time.
Best manages that very well by just simple device of laying the words out in unusual patterns, and it works very well. So let's look at the overall the sort of last chapter then. So spoiler alerts. I'm going to have to do a big old series wide spoiler alert to discuss these books. We probably are going to have to talk about the endings.
The statute of spoilers is well over for this.
Yes. I mean, we're talking over 50 years.
Even a 3-decade rule has been passed.
63 years, I think, since this one. So
First thing is there's a code halfway through or early on in the book.
Yes.
He's reading this code, and they completely sold me on what the code meant at the time. And I had to look back later and realise that I'd completely misinterpreted it in exactly the same way as Reich had. And I could see why he'd ended up as this obsessed madman, because he was so driven he hadn't actually stopped and paid attention.
I'm not thinking now. Okay, so here we go. Yeah, definite spoiler alert. If you don't want to know about how this ends, if you haven't read it yet and want to go away, then probably we'll see you next time. Goodbye. So, so basically the whole thing comes about because Reich sees that his stock is suddenly falling in an unanticipated way. His company's stock. Suddenly we're going down the tubes, and he doesn't know why. It's come out of nowhere. So he does a lot of analysis and works out that he needs the way to turn it around is to get a merger with his main rival, De Courtney. So he sends this bizarrely open to misinterpretation 4-letter code sequence that all the directors of big companies use. They send 4-letter codes at each other to do business. Seems open to problems, if you ask me. And as it turns out, he ends up basically he offers a merger, and the reply comes back no, when actually the reply should have came back yes or something. Because Tarek, was the code literally different?
They actually give you a list of the codes. They actually give you a list of the codes.
Yes.
And if you look at it, what comes back is yes, but he reads it as no. And because the story's driving so fast, I didn't stop to go back and look up what it actually said.
It's there on the page in front of you. It's in plain sight.
I missed
the
it
hook,
totally.
which is genius.
Brilliant.
What's worse is I did go back and I read it how he said it.
So you'd have gone and murdered him as well. Yeah.
And that's beautifully powerful writing.
Yes.
That you've got it there. It's if you were playing a computer game, you would look it up properly. You would actually notice that the response is something else.
The flow
you
of
were
it,
just, and this is sort of. I thought when it started, this was a bit like a Michael Bay opening. There was explosions everywhere. It was going at 100 miles an hour. You could barely hang on.
One single character typo passes entirely unnoticed, and off we go on a roaring rampage of revenge. Yeah.
And I assumed that the codes were, that what he'd read was what had been said. And it was only a bit later on, I actually went back and looked at the list of codes and worked out that, actually, yes, if I'd been paying attention, I'd have realised he was wrong from this point. It only became obvious far, far later in the story.
So then we have like a 200-page game of cat and mouse across the solar system using vast resources and two huge personalities clashing and stuff. At the end of which, Powell realises that the code actually wasn't what he thought anyway. So because Powell puts together enough evidence, largely because of one of the espers that Reich has helping him, just survives an assassination attempt and realises that Reich's got it in for him, so turns and helps the police out basically. But that all comes together as a set of evidence which the police computer, which Powell has to satisfy. He can't just put his own psychic evidence into court. He has to show it to the computer, and the computer has to agree a prosecution is possible. The computer rejects it all, which is fascinating, that you've got this vast sort of psychic powers at play and this huge organisation of espers and police and everything, and at the end of the day it all comes down to algorithms. Does it satisfy logic? And that's fantastic. So the computer comes back and says, no, it's not. That's no good. But then it tries. I think they try a different set of arrangements, and it comes back with a passion motive instead of a profit motive, which essentially is what Powell thought was going to happen. So it basically turns out that the material witness to the murder, a woman who saw Reich do it, but then went mad and disappeared and ran off, turns out to have been Reich's sister, and De Courtney, the man he murdered, turned out to be his long lost father all along, which was a bit of a strange one. I don't know. How did that go down? Did that seem believable, folks?
It explained. I think it focused on the death scene, the shooting scene, and it sort of all of a sudden that sort of made sense. But some of the double think that Reich had to have gone through to get to that point, to not, to seemingly, despite the fact that we're in his head, to not recognize his father, not recognize his sister. I'm put in mind of more modern spoilers, Mr. Robot. It's just the idea of a character not knowing himself and being blocked from knowing aspects of his personality and his history. That was
Well, certainly the whole book is an examination of various types of psychoses, but I'm wondering how believable it seems that Reich would totally have blanked out that, he didn't know who his own father was and happened to be in the right place at the right time. I don't know.
It sort of made sense in that it explained the obsession far better than making the money does.
Yeah, because Reich clearly has everything already at the start of the book.
Yeah. It's sort. I think that you can get away with it. It's sort of. It may not be perfect, but it seems to work.
Yeah.
There is a bit later on where, for me, the whole thing falls apart completely.
Yeah, yeah. So we get this sort of this sort of. It turns out the whole thing's actually a kind of Oedipal revenge tale thing going on all the way through, and then it goes into this weird place afterwards where, in addition to Powell basically works out that yes, this is what's happened. Oh, it's his father and so on. But then Powell, through some rationale that is never entirely made clear, decides and realizes that Reich is actually also some kind of reality warping demigod almost, and that needs to be stopped quite quickly. And so to do so ends up calling in a joint mass. It's called a mass cathexis, and it requires all of the espers in the world to remotely focus their energies on Powell, so Powell can do a thing, and that will rein in Reich, who is in danger of becoming. I don't even know what the threat is there. There's a whole page of weird sort of block capital text gibberish for a while. And then,
Well, I think that's just the reaction to the whole fear of change, and this is the man who's going to stop the change, but actually he's more change, and it really is jumping too far at that point.
It does. It go in the space of about 10 pages. It goes from quite a high-paced revenge sort of Oedipus sort of murder father-killing tale, which sort of makes its own internal sense, and then sort of ramps up to, oh, and by the way, Reich is capable of reordering reality in his own image if he isn't stopped somehow. And yeah.
They could have done with tiptoeing up to that a bit more rather than just jumping 2 feet first into
necessary.
it. I don't think it was.
It does lead to a fantastic sequence at the end there where Powell uses these donated powers to essentially collapse Reich's reality layer at a time. He's running around seeing that the stars have gone out, and then suddenly they're calling directory services and asking, "Where's the sun gone?" And it's all gone dark, and the voice comes back, "There is no sun." And basically, successive layers of his physical reality are being collapsed around him, and it's fantastically well written and interesting. But
that Demolition is massively powerfully written, and it's lived with me. I made a note to say, I still think of that Demolition. I can see that as a bit in a film.
Genuinely chilling.
Making a bit of a film of that would be really powerful. It would live with you. But he's the centre of the universe and the world revolves around him.
You're right.
Is the one bit that goes wrong. Yeah, exactly. It's just
suddenly he's like some sort of super being with weird powers.
It makes sense in Dune where they turn into half-worm things that create, longevity spice out of their anus, but it doesn't make quite so much sense when they're all people, using video phones.
Yeah. So at the end of that, they sort of he wakes up after all that, and he's found it just lying there in the street in a sort of bit of a trance. He goes away to a psychiatric hospital, and it turns out that the big demolition, the title drop, the Demolition Man, the Demolished Man, demolition itself is it turns out is just a kind of sort of psychiatric therapy, really, a kind of personality restructuring, because they recognise that important and powerful people are a valuable resource. We just need to retool him to be a bit more useful somehow. So he ends up in hospital. Yeah, his personality's wiped and rebuilt, presumably in a happier, more. Is that a harsh crime? Does that meet the crime? Does the punishment? Is that it?
Murder, death, and
death of the person, but we keep the man alive.
Arguably better than actual the death penalty, but the person is gone.
Yeah. Yes.
It feels like a massive overkill sort of thing to do to someone, but if you look at it where in the world, this is the first murder in God knows how many decades, then it is the ultimate
somewhere that's
crime.
mentioned that no one's murdered anyone successfully in 70 years or something like that, ever.
So in that case, you can see that they would use the ultimate sort of punishment, and this is a pretty ultimate punishment. I'd be a little bit dubious if Guantanamo Bay could do this to people because I think it could be. It's
but
not
is it
something
better
you
than
want to see.
Executing someone, rebuilding their personality, functionally the same. You end up with someone different at the end.
Exactly. It sort of feels like
Harsh.
actually it's the same thing, isn't it? It's a very, very efficient way of dealing with the problem.
Yes.
But efficiency isn't always a pleasant way of dealing with things.
Yeah. So, do we think it was a justified winner? I can't really remember what I can't remember. I don't know what the state of Hugo's. This was the first Hugo. What the state of the scene, the science fiction sort of genre was like in these days. Was this an admirable first award? Is this one that subsequent ones will be measured against?
Personally, I can see why it won. And it made me feel like I was back at university and I had that fake intellectual superiority having read the book. I'm looking down on everyone who hasn't read this. I've read this book. I'm importanter.
Because I think that's the scene in those days. This originally was published in 3 installments in Galaxy Science Fiction magazine in 1952. There's a picture there with the cover, and it's 35 cents magazine there. Obviously, we don't really have the magazines much in the same sense nowadays. Now we've got the internet and just general books and Kindles and so on. But would this have won today, do you think? Anyone?
Difficult to say. I don't understand the voting these days. It gets all confusing.
It would be a very different book today. I think it's been hugely influential because of its the insightfulness into into business as a driver, as a foundation for cyberpunk and dystopian sort of business sci-fi fiction.
Well, it had a big resurgence in sort of 80s and 90s,
yes,
but again today is less of a thing, I suppose. Yeah.
But I don't know. It would feel very different. I think the way they deal with female characters and characters of color would be very different than this is. This feels like a relatively enlightened book in some ways. There's two mentions I intentionally looked through it after I finished of sort of characters of color. Mary Noyes, Powell's assistant, is described in ways you might interpret as Latino,
right.
In a very initial physical description, but it's just that reference. And there's a reference to a character of color in one of the scenes. You probably may remember it, where in the recruiting department for the telepathy organization, there's a bunch of people queuing up to do the test to become telepaths.
Oh, right.
And there's a mental voice that somebody's saying, if you can hear this, go through the door on the left. And the character who wanders up and goes through that door is described as a character of color, which, given this is I checked, this is pre-educational segregation and 10 or 12 years before the Civil Rights Act. So just having a character of color wander up and be accepted into the elite guild
for its time,
small detail, but quite telling in terms of Bester's sort of social awareness, which is quite interesting. So I think he'd have probably been on the progressive wing of recent sci-fi happenings. But who can tell? It's half a century.
It seemed very much of its time. It's talking about the 24th century, but you can tell they're all dressed like characters from Mad Men, but with like those glowing hoops over the shoulders of their suits, that kind of thing, like Futurama. It's very 50s and 60s. Ben Wright's very, very big on Brill cream,
Absolutely.
There's some of the science fiction elements, just like the trip to Venus they take, and there's gardens on Venus, and that's just a lovely moment of just sort of places it in the scientific progression.
No real thought of terraforming or anything. They just assumed it was all jungle and whatever back then anyway. But yeah.
I think what would happen is, I think Alfred Bester would win an Oscar today, but I don't think this book would. If he was writing today, he'd write something else.
Yeah.
But the power and strength of his writing, whatever he wrote today, would be a winner. Because there's just something about the way he writes this story.
Yeah, I mean, having read quite a few of in recent months and years, I've been trying to catch up on all of them basically, and having read quite a few in a broad spread of various decades worth of Hugo's, this definitely deserves its place amongst that Hall of Fame. Certainly, the pacing, the sort of the fresh vision and the interesting ideas that are sort of worked through and in quite a thoughtful manner as well. I definitely think it sort of deserves its win.
Well, it definitely deserves it just from the fact that it has influenced so much coming after it, either directly or indirectly. And we know there are some very direct influences.
Yeah. Yeah, that's where you talk about Babylon 5.
Oh, yes.
Yes, because at this point, it's probably worth mentioning Babylon 5, where Walter Koenig plays a character called Bester, Alfred Bester, who is in charge of the Psychops, who are a division of psychics who basically police the world. And if you have psychic powers, you are forced to go live with the Psychops and be brought up by them as a child, or have to take drugs and not be part of them.
The core is father, the core is mother, yeah.
This idea basically comes directly from this book, and
he's almost quoting some sections, isn't he?
Stravinsky could not be saying more by saying that this is Alfred Bester.
Yeah, calling the main character Bester, absolutely.
There is absolutely nothing more that can be said that this is a major influence. And
I mean, there's no the League of the Esper Guild itself. It doesn't come across nearly as sinister, but there's a sort of implied sense that you have to join them, and there's no real choices about your life once you're part of that organisation. But most members of it seem to go along with it and seem to understand the reasons. So perhaps it's not as sinister, but
and in Babylon 5 it's exactly the same. You are forced to have a child with another person,
just essentially so what amounts to eugenics,
and all of those ideas are there, and they aren't that dodgy from their point of view in Babylon 5. It's only when
it's context.
It's only when you're looking from the outside that it starts to look very, very sinister and a bit weird. And even in the book, it's a very sinister organisation when you stop to think about how much control they have over your life if you have these powers. You don't have any real free will. You have to be part of this.
Well, I mean, it's even just the 90% tax rate is a fairly sinister thing, isn't it?
Yes, I think it gets mentioned at some point. They donate most of their income to the ongoing programmes of the Esper Guild. It becomes essentially a small nation state of its own. And clearly they see themselves as the future of mankind.
When you're introduced to the Esper Guild, it's presented as this sort of calm, managed, sensible structure. Participating positively in society. You're introduced to it via the means of a very sort of affable police character, Powell, who's helping society and righting wrongs. But particularly as you go into that final segment with the whoop singularity bit, the fact that you've had an organisation has been pootling along, playing nice, and then suddenly they go, there is a material threat to us and maybe the world, but certainly to us. So we're going to invoke executive authority and edit the world and destroy this person.
Yeah, when you see what they can and will do on the safe side of just one of their members tracking down one murderer, you sort of wonder what else they're capable of. Yeah.
So the transition, as we've discussed, feels a little problematic, but at the same time, that kind of one card showing of everything shining happy, and then the card flips and you realise no, that's what's potentially behind the scenes, because some of the characters, some of the people Reich pull into the Esper, the tier 1 Esper character he pulls in, Gus. One of the things he's talking about is there being about a giant conspiracy of Espers and how he wants to take control of this conspiracy. And lo and behold, in the final third of the book, ta-da! Esper conspiracy. The things they were worried, the things Reich didn't like, were there all along and get revealed.
Yeah. So good, interesting stuff. So, what do we think? Do we recommend that? Should folks go and get this one? So good.
Absolutely, I'd say
absolutely.
So. Yeah, it's a cracking read, and it's fairly short, so it's easy to read.
That is something I noticed.
Dashes on. It's so fast and light to absorb, but at the same time, without
being
here. Fluffy. It's really enjoyable.
250 pages on the nail. Obviously it's perhaps a bit fatuous to be judging sci-fi classics on volume, on depth of pages and so on. But I guess it's because back then they didn't really have all these extra categories which you have in the Hugos now. There's about 5 or 6 different written form categories, and each of them based on novel length. The novel's now 40,000 words or more, whereas presumably back at the start there was much less sort of differentiation, and there was just the one category. You didn't really
have large sci-fi novels in the same way back then. Now they have got big.
Well, particularly since you're
Never mind the quality, feel the width.
But back then, I'm a massive fan of some of the 30s sci-fi, and the short story really ruled there when it came to the interesting work. And as it got further and further on, the books got longer and longer until you get to now when you don't just have a book, you have 3, 5, however many chapters in a story.
Multiple volumes, Yeah,
So
and obviously the main means for getting your work out in those days was part work installments in magazines. So you had to try and keep it down to a certain sort of efficiency, I suppose. Yeah.
Well, it worked for Dickens.
Yeah. Excellent. So we'd probably better wind up there. I'm not going to do scores. I think that's probably not helpful, but would definitely recommend you go out and look for this. You can find it pretty much anywhere. It's still in general publication. Not all of the Hugos are. We're going to have some trouble tracking some of them down.
It's on Kindle. It's in print as part of the Sci-Fi Masterworks series. It's not an Audible. Which is weird, but then again, I'm not entirely sure how you would do an audiobook version of some of the interesting typographical bits inside the book.
Yes.
That would get disorienting, wouldn't it? Yeah.
There are sections of the book where they're talking in patterns, and you get the feeling that when they're talking as a
some of their names are
psychos,
made up of punctuation. There's a chap called Atkins, and that is literally the at symbol, KINS.
Some wonderful text speak, isn't it?
that is so now.
Text speak in
Yes.
1953. I love it. Brilliant. So we probably better round up there then. So join us next time on this particular feature thing, where we'll be picking out another Hugo winner and discussing it at length. Until then, see you next time.